Hello, and welcome to Science on the 7th live stream, a virtual space where we talk about issues related to air quality and health. I'm your host, Pallavi Pant. It is the month of February, and in many places around the world, people are still experiencing winter conditions, which also means they require heating, which means pollution levels may be relatively high, especially in locations where people are having to rely on wood or coal for heating in particular. Oftentimes, on this live stream, we've talking about the various ways in which air pollution can impact people's health. And some of you who follow the live stream and also follow our work at HEI, you will know that last year we released our most recent State of Global Air report, which presented for the first time information on how air pollution impacts brain health. So today we are hoping to spend a little bit of time trying to understand what the air that we breathe day in and day out does to our brains. Did you know that someone in the world right now is developing dementia every 3 seconds? And we know that there are a number of factors that can impact the development of the disease and also the progression of the disease. What the Lancet Commission said in 2024 was that 45%, so very close to about half of all dementia cases, are potentially preventable if we can address the modifiable risk factors that are impacting the disease development and progression. And air pollution, as you may guess, is one of those modifiable risk factors. So I'm really excited to be welcoming Dr. Burcin Ikiz today. She is a neuroscientist who works at the intersection of brain health, climate change, and global health policy. She has a long bio, so I'll try and give you a few highlights really quickly. She is an adjunct lecturer at the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford University. And very, very importantly, she's the chair of the International Neuroclimate Working Group, which is a global consortium bringing together over 300 scientists, clinicians, policymakers, advocates, public health leaders, and trying to make advances across research, policy, and action. She also serves on the Lancet Psychiatry Commission on Climate Change and Mental Health, and is working on the Global Mental Health Action Network for the COP31 Action Group. I could go on and on, but Burcin, really thrilled to have you here, especially given how much you have been doing trying to, create community around this issue of brain health and how environmental factors can impact it and what we might do to change it. So really, welcome.
Thank you so much, Pallavi. I'm so excited for our conversation on this topic.
Great. So I'm going to start with a simple question since we tend to focus on air pollution. What is the air quality like where you are today? And I know it's really early for you. So maybe what was it like yesterday?
Yeah, I was actually just checking it this morning as I was preparing to have this conversation. And I live in San Francisco, and our AQI right now is in the 70s. So still considered pretty average for this time of year in the city. And it's at moderate levels. Yeah.
Moderate levels, that's good. So our topic today is air pollution and the impacts on brain health. And it's a huge topic, right? We have this graphic, if we can pull that up from our report, which you and your colleagues from the Neuro Group contributed, looking at the various ways that air pollution can impact the health of our brains across the lifespan. So, what do we really know about this connection between exposure to air pollution and the impact on our brains?
Yes, absolutely. So there's growing and strong evidence from our group and our colleagues over the last decades that show that air pollution impacts our brains throughout the lifespan. Like you said, from in utero to the aging adults, our brains get affected. So we have cohorts that had looked at pregnant women who have been exposed to air pollution in 1990. So we had the chance to really observe those fetuses that had the exposure and what happened to them throughout their early adulthood. And we know that that exposure really changed the brain structure of the brain of the fetuses. And these babies were born more prematurely and at lower birth weight, which put them at risk of having neurodevelopmental disorders, because the last period of gestation is really critical for brain development. And these children usually had higher risks of having neurodevelopmental delays. They were walking more later, they were talking later, and they had higher risk of being diagnosed with autism and ADHD and similar neurodevelopmental disorders in early childhood. And in adolescence, and we know that air pollution exposure also affects cognitive performance, executive functioning in children. We know it from anywhere from the test scores that are taken on really polluted air. And in adolescence, especially in early adulthood, is a critical period for mental health. And we know that air pollution can increase risk of having depression, anxiety, increases the suicide risk. And in later adulthood, as you had mentioned, air pollution exposure is considered one of the biggest risk factors for stroke and for Alzheimer's and similar dementias. This was in 2020. We had the Lancet Commission report that showed that one of the modifiable risk factors for dementia is air pollution. And then WHO went ahead and updated their prevention guidelines for dementia, putting air pollution in 2023 for the first time. And now we're actually, together with WHO, updating those prevention guidelines to be able to really reflect the growing evidence in this space.
So clearly, not surprisingly, though, we see these huge impacts across the lifespan. But let me zoom in on dementia for a minute. Also, because if we leave aside air pollution for a minute, we do hear more and more about dementia being a health issue that we need to be thinking about more. We need better health systems. And as you know, our report recently highlighted over 500,000 dementia deaths being linked to air pollution exposure, and that's in a single year. So, nearly 600,000 deaths in 1 year. I think we have a map that we can also pull up. So we know that dementia is a disease that is going to impact older people more. And if we look at this map here, it just shows, where we see the largest impacts across the world, and the yellows and the reds indicate countries with higher impacts. So we are already seeing, big countries and countries in that we would classify as low and middle income countries seeing those larger impacts. That's also where population aging is expected to happen much more rapidly. So given that, what do you think the next 2 or 3 decades are going to look like in terms of how the health impacts might manifest and how we might prepare for it, especially in the context of air pollution as well?
Yes, absolutely. Great question. There was a big report that came in 2019 showing that if just from looking at the aging population, that the estimations were by 2050, the number of people living with dementia would triple. And this didn't really count for any modifiable risk factors, definitely not air pollution. And what I think about, it was so striking to see in the report that 1 out of 4 dementia deaths are attributable to air pollution in 1 year in 2023. And so I see this as knowing this fact gives me, when I think about the future, either really scares me, because if we don't do anything, that would mean probably now accounting for also air pollution and other environmental factors, the numbers will not be tripling, but it will be maybe quadrupling. And we will be seeing people getting dementia at much younger ages. So it won't be people in their 70s or 80s, but we have now growing evidence that show that it ages the brain so much faster that we may be seeing people getting dementia in their 50s, in their 60s, at their midlife, where they're the most productive, where they're taking care of their young ones and their older ones. So it would really affect the communities very drastically if we don't do anything. But it also gives us this knowledge, the opportunity to do something, because knowing that being able to act on clean air regulations and so on can have a very positive major difference in lowering these numbers and making sure that the population will not be impacted this vastly by the problem.
Yeah, thank you for for sharing that. And I think if you really think about the fact that people could develop the disease at much earlier in life, that is scary. But yes, if the factors are modifiable, then there's hope. We can do things to try and control it. That's often the first question people, but can we fix it? Yes, we can. But one question that you've probably also heard from many people is dementia or some of the other diseases, and the impacts that we're talking about can come from a variety of factors, including your, social environment around you, smoking status, for instance, or a number of other factors. So, what makes us confident that it's really air pollution and not those other factors? What kind of research have people done to look at the relationships between air pollution and brain health? I've seen some fascinating studies that were initially done on dogs, trying to understand, their brains and what the impact of pollution was in Mexico. So, what kinds of research have people done that helps us be confident in saying that air pollution is really a risk factor for these diseases?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a very valid question. That's why we are trying to really sure the evidence base is there to be able to speaking and to be able to make people make confident, informed decisions at policy levels, at government levels. So very, very important question. We probably have when we think about brain health and the environment, we have probably one of the most robust evidence in this space around air pollution. And initially, what we learned about how air pollution increases the risk, when I said increased risk for neurodevelopmental disorders or dementia, majority of those studies were large epidemiological cohorts. So looking at large populations over years, sometimes decades, and in multiple different geographic locations. And those gave us these associations, these linkages. And they were able to, when these studies are done, they also were able to eliminate other confounders. So that may be, so whether it's the socioeconomic status or education levels, that may also have, we know, impacts on dementia development and or not. And so after removing all those confounders and being able to do actually a dose impact, so seeing like at lower air pollution levels, this is how much, at higher pollution levels, these were how much, they were able to get some confidence in associations, so more in the relation of air pollution and brain health. But it doesn't mean that air pollution from that knowledge cause these brain health impacts. Then there was more kind of natural experiments happened where we saw these like in places like in China or Mexico, where clean air regulations did pass through, and then the air it got cleaner over weeks or months period. And then we were able to look at long-term data from these countries or these cities that were in the countries from before the air regulation happened and after, and we'll be able to see, and again getting rid of the confounders, be able to see, wow, this is a really drastic change that gave us a more of a causative understanding. Again, not exactly causation, but more of a that way understanding. And then finally, there were a lot of researchers who were more molecular cellular neurobiologists, such as myself, where it was looking at being in a lab in a very controlled environment with animal models or with human brain cells or other models. Really do these studies where you can increase, or sometimes even actually putting mice in the highways next to highways and see what happens to them, being able to study their brains afterwards, being able to look at the pathology, what happened in the brains when everything else was controlled, but it was really just what they were breeding compared to the control groups. We were able to gather information on the mechanisms of how air pollution reaches to the brain and how it impacts. So we know that the air can enter, the air pollutants can enter our brains through either directly from our olfactory bulb, from our noses, or it could cause systemic inflammation in our lungs and so on. And these, either the pollutants or the systemic inflammatory markers, then goes onto the blood, and from that gets carried through the blood-brain barrier to our brains and cause inflammation, oxidative stress, and that harms the neurons, the brain cells that live in our brains.
Yeah, this is always an interesting question, but also clearly so many different types of evidence that are now coming together to make us, feel confident in that sort of statement of air pollution being a risk factor. But science is always evolving, and there's always gaps. So, what are some of the open questions that researchers are currently interested in looking at, or areas of the world where we still need more data, more information from?
Ah, great question. Yes, absolutely. We our job never stops. We have a lot of knowledge gaps we need to fill in this space. I would say some of the areas that we have the still developing understanding is looking at long-term multiple factors. So when we look at in the lab, for example, the studies have done, it's very short periods of time you could able to look, but our brains are actually very resilient organs, and they are very functional organs. They always want to retain function. So they're really good at masking damage. And so we would see it, for example, in neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. By the time people go to see neurologists because their memory lapses or their movements of like not being able to button their shirt get to a point of really impacting their lives, and then they go see neurologists, they get tests done, and they get the diagnosis of having a Parkinson's disease diagnosis or an Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. It actually, we know that it's almost too late in the disease process at that stage to do something about it, that the disease had started maybe 5, 10, 20 years ago. And it came to a stage of almost no return where we really understand and see the symptoms, because the brain is so good at masking and saying, okay, everything's fine, I'll go try this neuron. If this one doesn't work, we'll handle it. But and so what happens, what we need to understand is what happens when usually in other parts of the world, it's not just the air pollution, but it's also heat, or it's also emotional trauma. It's also these other factors that we know that affects our brain health coming at the same time in real life, in long periods of time, long-term exposures. And we need to really understand what are those effects, compounding effects, impact on our brains in long term. We need to better understanding of the mechanisms, so we can actually talk about being able to slow them up. And also, there's still so little data coming from communities, populations that are the most vulnerable, the frontline communities, the more from the global south. One of the two studies we're doing now that we're very excited is one is in Latin America, looking at how heat and air pollution impacts brain aging and dementia in Latin America. And the other one is about how air pollution and heat impacts children's cognition in India and in other places of South Asia. And I think hopefully those, and understanding how we can translate this knowledge into policy action and so on, are the places that needs the most understanding still.
Yeah, clearly lots of work to do. And actually, what you were describing in terms of how the disease progression might happen really hits home, because that's how my grandma was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And by the time the diagnosis happened, there was nothing, you could just manage the symptoms and, do the best you can. So clearly, as much as we can work on these modifiable risk factors, we can try and reduce some of those pressures. But as we were talking about, these various impacts, I'm also thinking, but if we know about these connections, there's potentially work that's already happening to try and address it. You mentioned briefly about the WHO guidelines. So I'm curious if there's any policy initiatives or clinical initiatives or other ways that people are thinking about this connection between air pollution and brain health, and trying to tackle it either from a mitigation point of view or making a case for air pollution reduction as a way of improving brain health. Like, could you give us some examples along those lines?
Yes, absolutely. I always try to, when we talk about solutions and ways, I always try to say we really don't need a sexy new technology. We don't even have to use AI. It's quite simple. We know that these clean air policies do work in improving a health span of individuals, of communities, and that includes brain health. There's incredible co-benefits to our brain health when we make cities greener, and we know that it cleans the air. We know that it provides shade and a heat mitigation, and it gives wonderful opportunities for social connection, physical activity for people living in those places to have green spaces. So and those are really, really physical activity, social connection, and also for mental health. Just even seeing green spaces can have incredible impacts on our mental health, on our brain health. So all those things can be really beneficial to our brain health. Similarly, having clean infrastructure, cleaner water that doesn't contain any lead or heavy metals that can impact neurodevelopment, clean air, disaster preparedness, because there's so much now studies coming out on our understanding of how wildfires and floods can impact our brain health. And with wildfires, when we talk about it, it's the air pollution, it's the water soil contamination, it's the emotional trauma of having gone through extreme weather event. All of those compounding factors come together to affect our physical health, our mental health, and we know that if we are well prepared then those disasters will be coming or harming less, and as those will have indirect brain health impacts as well. So there's a lot of policies that will help with the climate mitigation and clean air policies, and that will use clean energy. All of those will be also improving our brain health.
Yeah. Thank you for, those. I think that that's always such a critical piece, that in addition to highlighting all the ways that this is bad for us, like here's all the ways that we can, work to fix it. And, as we are coming towards the close of our conversation, I also know that this is an issue that is deeply personal to you, as it tends to be for so many people who work in this space. But you have extended family in India where people all year round experience high levels of air pollution. You're a mother, so you're obviously thinking about, your children and their well-being, and also, very unfortunate that you witnessed the LA fires, which were particularly devastating last year. I'm curious how these different aspects, which are not necessarily, the data and the science and the research, how these experiences and connections in your personal life influence what you do and how you do what you do.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think it's really important to show the evidence, but also the personal stories behind it. And the thing with climate change and air pollution and all that is that it is becoming all of our personal part of our personal stories. And I had that experience last year too, as you have mentioned. So for me, I've studied brain health for over 20 years, but the reason why I chose to look into climate change and air pollution and what they do to our brains started out of that personal interest of having young children and being worried about my youngest one has severe asthma. And so it was being worried about them and their health. But of course, as a parent, or as an aunt, as a grandparent, when you loving one child means loving all the children. There's no difference. So when you start caring for one, it just feels like, yeah, but if I'm doing all these things to protect my child, what about that other child over there? You care for them too, and you want to do something for them. So it was really realizing that we didn't know much about how climate change, this was 4 or 5 years ago, or air pollution impacts our brains, or people were working really in isolation. And I want to bring people together, knowing that there's power in numbers. If we come together, we learn from each other, we act together, that will make so much more impact. And then everything did become really personal last year when we had the LA wildfires starting. That was one of the most devastating wildfires in California history, starting only a couple miles away from us. And we had to evacuate for a while, and then we were able to come back. And we were fortunate, we had our house back, but we just didn't know what was in the air. We didn't know what was in the soil, in the water. And just thinking, we had privately tested my son's preschool sandbox where they just play every day, a couple of months after the fires happened, and they found all kinds of heavy metals in it. And that kind of really breaks your heart, thinking about all the other children again playing in those parks. Or when I think about in India, our relatives, our colleagues with children that are seeing in places like New Delhi, air quality index at around like 800, so sometimes 1,000, and even if you're just stuck home, and what that doesn't mean being stuck home with an air filter for a child's social development and mental health, right? That's a whole another thing. They cannot go to school, but also day in and out, being able to expose to that air pollution. What is that doing to the brain health and or like physical health of the individuals? It really tugs at your heart, and that's why we're doing the work we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is so true. I mean, there tend to be so many invisible ways in which this can impact you as an individual. I get, like, especially in winter, from my sister every day, like, okay, if I did this, but I was wearing a mask, is it okay or not? What would happen? And, sometimes you also just don't know. Like, it's unclear. We're not able to give as clear a guidance, or information. So this is hard. But I think one of the things that you have done incredibly well, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many others, is doing that invisible work of bringing people together that you alluded to a little bit. And what I would describe as field building, trying to bring in not just the scientists together, but also bringing in people that are thinking about policy impacts, people who are trying to build better awareness around these topics. And it is amazing the way that the group that you started has grown, the International Neuroclimate Working Group, and everything that I have learned just by following the group and paying attention to what is being discussed there. And I think, to me, that is something that is motivating. And I'm curious what motivates you to keep working in this space, and also what gives you hope for future.
Yes, thank you. I think it's really important to finish with hope and action. So thank you for pointing to that. A lot of things gives me hope. One of the things is knowing how simple the solution is. It's again, it's not a fancy technology that we have to create. It's not. It is just the policy changes can make, and small acts to improve the environments can have such drastic improvements in the lives and health spans of people. We know this, and especially focusing on the equity aspect, making sure everybody has access to greener spaces, to cleaner air, to cleaner water. This is really crucial work. So I think there's a lot of I see our role as biggest thing is to expand the knowledge, but then being able to disseminate that knowledge and find ways to make this knowledge easily translatable into action. And what inspires me are these community groups, such as the Warrior Moms in India, that we know that work so hard for the concerns for their health of their children, coming together, protesting, knocking on the government's doors, or educating schools and so on. Really, I was talking with an neuroethicist, a colleague the other day, and he was saying, is it good to know or not to know all these bad things that could happen to you? And we were having a discussion, and I was thinking, yes, knowing can bring a lot of stress, these impacts, especially when we had those wildfire. All my friends were like, oh, fire's over now, let's go out and play. And I was like, oh, but long term. And knowing can be really stressful, but knowing also puts you into action, can make you have this collective action coming together. And I think that inspires me. People coming together, it doesn't have to be their profession, it doesn't have to, but they have the power to make changes, bring about changes, and then the policymakers being able to see this, the local governments, and act on it, and us just providing the evidence and the tools that will help them to be able to do that.
Thank you for those words of encouragement and hope. I do agree with you. We knowledge is power, as we say, but trying to find that balance between, here's the problem that we're trying to deal with, but here's all the solutions, and here's ways in which we already know that they work, is so important. And this has been a fascinating conversation. I think what I'm taking away is, yes, we do have good, strong evidence on the links between exposure to air pollution and brain health. If we are not paying sufficient attention to it and thinking about how to address the problem, we may see more cases, and more health impacts. And for some of the diseases here, like we didn't get a chance to touch on it, but the I think critical piece is that it isn't just the individual that has to live with the disease. It is also the family and the community impacts that can come from it, especially caregiving roles that you really need within your family, within your community. But that there is hope. There are solutions that work. And as you said, a lot of them are common sense solutions that don't require tons of new data, new technologies. We know what to do. We've seen it work. So I'm really hoping that this conversation will continue, and also that if people are interested in learning more, much more beyond this very, very short conversation, please do find the International Neuroclimate Working Group. I believe it is on LinkedIn now.
Yes,
So people
we have
can
a
come
website
follow
now
me.
too.
Amazing. So hopefully more people are gonna find ways to connect, and we shall continue to work towards better air quality for everybody. And Burcin, thank you so very much for joining us today and for all of the work you're doing outside and from behind the scenes. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to staying in touch. Thank you so very much. And everyone who's listening in, thank you too. We're going to be back in March with another conversation. Until then, please stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you, Pallavi.